Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I please ask you to put your telephones on silence if you haven't done this yet? Well, time and rocks. Then you have a geologist. Okay? So I would like to, in this presentation or in the introduction to the presentation, like you to stretch your imagination. You sit comfortably, close your eyes, and think back 15 years. Where would you be sitting here? Well, you would be sitting on bare rocks. No university, nothing, just rocks. Think back 30,000 years ago. There was glaciers at the poles, and the sea level was down 100 meters. So you wouldn't even probably see the sea from here, still sitting at your spot. Well, how about 30 million years ago? You'd be sitting in the middle of volcanoes. The Red Sea doesn't even exist. It's erupting, it's spreading, right? Is that a big stretch of your imagination? Well, it's just the beginning of the journey that Martin von Kranendonk will take you on today. And Martin actually is a born Canadian. So he got his PhD in 1992, but probably the most important bit of this is that he spent 20 years of his life mapping rocks in some of the most remote areas of this world, in northern Labrador, and when he moved to Canada in 1994, in the northwestern part of Canada. So in 2012, Martin became professor at the University New South Wales in Sydney, where he is ever since. He's a director of the Australian Institute of Astrobiology and the director of the Institute of Big Questions. And one of the big questions is, how did life generate on Earth, and is there life on other planets? So, working on these questions, he has appeared in many radio shows and television shows. He is part of the IMAX movie, which we will have a premiere of, an Arabian premiere tonight in the movie theater here. And so he's the author of numerous books and articles, etc., like the good academician. But if you really want to see a happy geologist, then you have to take Martin out to the field. And this is here in Saudi Arabia a couple of days ago, and his finger is pointing at 100 million years. It's a time gap between the rocks on the left, which are 800 million years, and the rocks on the right, which are 700 million years. And these rocks on the right have signs of the earliest life in Arabia, and that's really young compared to the stuff that he will be talking about now. So without further ado, Martin, please take.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking your time to come and listen to me this afternoon. As Volker said, I'm a geologist. I look at rocks. I love rocks. Talk about them all day long. I'm going to bore you to death about rocks. But the great thing is Mars also has rocks. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Mars, history of life on Earth, and how we use those two to start to understand better the very early history of our solar system and whether there could be life on another planet. So this is my resume. I've been investigating the rocks of our planet for 39 years. Our group studies the oldest life on Earth, 3.7 to 3.5 billion years ago, and we apply that knowledge to the search for ancient life in the solar system. That is astrobiology in a nutshell. Can we apply what we know on Earth, where there's the example of one of life, to guess where we might go and see if we can find life elsewhere? But as Volker sort of hinted, I've got a secret to share with you. I am actually a time traveler. I have witnessed the dinosaurs going extinct 65 million years ago. I have been able to visit ancient inhabitations where life got its foothold 3 billion years ago or more. I've witnessed even the formation of the solar system. And in fact, I've even seen exploding stars, 8 billion years old or more. How do I do this, you ask? Do I have superhuman powers? Do I have hidden attributes that allow me to travel around? Do I have my own TARDIS that allows me to go in places around the universe? No, I have these. These are the rocks that we've been talking about. And they are actually time capsules. This is a picture here from the pavement outside the inn where I'm staying, but it could be anywhere in the world. And when you start to look and observe nature, you see texture, varieties, and stories. So these rocks, they don't look all that exciting, but this rock might be 500 years old. Very old, right? Well, this one might be 500,000 years old. Another pebble on the beach with a different color and texture might be 50 million years old. And if we're really lucky, we may find just remnants of the very early history of the Earth. 3 billion, 3.5 billion years old. So these are my time capsules. And if I travel around the world, I can see stories preserved in the rocks that allow me to see those events. So this little horizon in New Zealand is rich in elements that only come from meteorites. And it's full of ash from a global fire that was caused by an impact that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. This unit here is some of the most primitive life on Earth, almost 3 billion years ago. And they're sitting within sands that are being washed by waves. I can go back to that environment and see how life was living on Earth 3 billion years ago. And of course, there are materials from meteorites that are some of the earliest formation mechanisms of the solar system. These little grains of olivine are actually the same age as when our planet formed, 4.567 billion years ago. And of course, who here has some gold? Who's wearing gold at the moment? I've got a gold wedding band. Gold is only formed when stars explode. And gold then became part of our planet because it reaccumulated as the Earth was forming and came from much older stars. So if you look at the gold you're wearing, you are looking back through immense measures of time. I'm actually very lucky. I get to walk on time every day. That's an interesting concept because I can put my foot on rocks that are 3 billion years old, that were at a beach, that were in the deep oceans. We can all do this. We all have the chance to go out and explore our natural settings. So here in Saudi, we have a range of rocks that go from about 800 million years until today, and that spans the time from the development of the most primitive organisms, just single-celled bugs, up to through the age of the dinosaurs until, of course, the rise of man. And there are very recent volcanic eruptions showing that Arabia is a geologically active area. Where I work in Western Australia, we have rocks that are extremely ancient. They're 3.5 billion years old. They're only preserved in 1 or 2 places around the world because plate tectonics recycles crust, and we lose that record. So these are some of the oldest rocks on Earth, and they have traces of the oldest life on the planet in the form of these structures formed by communities of microorganisms, leaving their record for us to go and visit. So, aside from that, though, anything older, we actually have no record. In the very earliest part of history, in that area of red, there's no geological record left. It's been completely wiped out by very large meteorites that impacted the Earth until about 3.8 billion years ago. And this is probably the time when life got started on our planet. So there's nowhere we can go and see that record. So planet Earth is an imperfect planet as far as a geologist goes. So what about Mars? Has anybody actually seen Mars through a telescope? Has anybody had the chance to see it? A couple of you? Yeah, it's a tiny little red dot. Looks very boring. Even the most powerful telescopes can only just discern the polar ice caps. Can you see that little bright horizon up on the top left? the North and the South poles have CO2 ice, dry ice. Not water, CO2. And you can just make it out with some of the telescopes. It doesn't look very interesting, but it's fascinated humanity for many generations already. The good thing about Mars is it's quite a bit smaller than the Earth. And as a result, all that geological activity, which we still have here in Saudi Arabia, ended on Mars about 3 billion years ago. It cooled, it lost all its heat to space. The good thing about that for us is that it preserves a very ancient record of processes on its surface in that gap that we don't have on Earth. And this is what that crust looks like on Mars. Once you get below the dust and the rather featureless surface, the ancient crust is pockmarked with craters. That's very different to how the Earth crust looks. And it's because meteorites were very active in the early part of making the solar system and then died off through time. So on our young crust, on Earth's young crust, we only see a few meteorite impact craters. But on ancient crust like this, every square centimeter is covered by an impact event. And it shows that the crust on Mars formed very, very early indeed. So I always get asked, could life have got started on Mars? Without the ongoing plate tectonics and big volume of water that we have on Earth, was there actually a chance for life to get started on Mars? And of course, we're not talking about elephants or beautiful fish in the sea. There's no indication for very complex life at all. It's really single-celled life that we're talking about, primitive life. And the question really comes, can we see through that surface environment, which doesn't look very exciting? So if you had a satellite, and there are satellites that are orbiting Mars at the moment, these are pictures taken looking down on the surface of Mars of a dust devil. You would probably have them here in Saudi Arabia. They're little wind tornadoes that pick up the dust. You're looking down on a dust devil there from satellite, and this is a series of pictures from a rover looking at a dust devil going across the surface of Mars. So it's still an active planet, but it's dry. It's windy. It's not very exciting in terms of life. And those dust devils actually leave their trails on the surface of Mars. Isn't that beautiful? So these are the kinds of textures that I, as a geologist, look at. I look at textures like this and then infer process. On Mars, we're lucky we can still see the process in terms of the dust devil going across. And of course, if you look in other places, you can see the multiply impacted basement rocks, and these dark horseshoe shapes are sand dunes, just like here in Saudi Arabia, blown by wind that traveled from north to south, making these beautiful dunes. But instead of the light yellow sand in Saudi Arabia, it's dark red, iron-rich material, making the dunes. But the good news is there is evidence for water on Mars. There's not a lot of it, but this picture from the European Space Agency actually shows a puddle of frozen water now in the bottom of a crater. And can you see on the edges the white hoarfrost, which means that there's actually a little bit of moisture in the air, water moisture in the air. Well, that doesn't look like a lot of water, but in the summertime, we can see these dark rivulets on the edge of a crater flowing down into the bottom, and that's running liquid water on Mars today. And in fact, very recently, there have been discoveries of big volumes of ice, water ice, preserved just beneath that dry, dusty surface. The area highlighted in blue is a thick layer of ice on the edge of a crater. So there's quite a bit of water material preserved on or just under the surface of Mars. But if we go back, and this is really good for, the vision that Elon Musk and others have of colonizing Mars. You need resources there. So can you imagine blasting up the tons and tons of water that a human colony would need to survive? Well, the water's already there. So knowing that now can provide opportunities for colonizing Mars, maybe in the future. I don't think that's very likely to happen, but people are working in that direction. More importantly for our interests is that there's evidence of past water on Mars. And not just a little bit, but big volumes, planetary-wide hydrological systems. This was a photograph taken in the 1970s already from an early mission. And can you see those lobes of gravel that are coming out of that impact crater? That impact crater is about 75 kilometers across, and those lobes are wet, right? If you hit a dry surface, you'll get sprays, linear sprays of ejecta, but this is a splosh. This fell into a wet surface environment and broke up the rocks in this sploshy pattern. So they hadn't recognized it back then, but now we know how these things form. It's very clear. There's also widespread evidence of the mineral, clay minerals, which only form by the interaction of rocks with water. These have been identified spectroscopically from space, and you can see how widespread those clays are. So water must have covered a lot of that surface. And I don't know if anybody remembers the famous blueberries that were found by the Opportunity rover. These are little iron nodules. They're only about this big, and they also only form through the interaction of rock and water through weathering. And we also know from those missions that there are layered rocks here that were laid down by standing bodies of water, big lakes, these bedded sulfate deposits. And in fact, it wasn't just a bit of water, but there were massive flooding events. This image on the top left, you can see from the left, a sort of breakaway area with a channel, and the water is flowed out to the top right and taken along all those little blocks. So it's a massive event of water flowing across the surface. Again, those larger craters are about 100 kilometers in diameter, so these are big systems. And if you look more carefully at some of those areas, you'll see that sort of texture on the bottom right. That looks very much like icebergs floating on the surface that get broken up and jostled. So it's not ice here, but it's sort of some sedimentary material that has been moved along by water. So big events. And some of those systems, here's a beautiful anastomosing river channel, shown in that green sort of line that goes from A to B to C and then up to D into the crater. That's a big single river, 800 kilometers long. So that's like the size of the Amazon on Mars. And all of this is about 3.8 to 4.2 billion years old. Very ancient record of flowing water on Mars. So people have put together this model. Here's a timeline from formation of the solar system on your left through to 3.5 on our right. There was this period that's known as the warm and wet period on Mars. And you can see the age there. So that's really good because, we know that everywhere on Earth, life needs water to survive. But the question is, was this enough to get life started on Mars? Just having the presence of water, is that enough? Well, it turns out that, following the water, if you have life, is really only half of the problem. Life, even just a single cell, is an incredibly complicated machine. It has a triple layer of lipids. It's got DNA, it's got internal organelles, it's got pumps, it's got to move. They're unbelievably sophisticated machines. What turns out to be really important about thinking of whether life can get a foothold on another planet is the period before life got started. So with all those components in life, you have to start with the simple building blocks available in the solar system and make them more complicated. And it turns out that that process of making more complicated molecules, water is the enemy. And so we have to start asking ourselves, did Mars have the right ingredients for going from this simple transition of organic molecules that you can find in meteorites on the left to very complex molecules, to DNA, and to life? And what I've highlighted in the red circles are two big knowledge gaps in understanding how life got started. Of course, there are many, but the key questions for astrobiology are, how did life get started, and where did life get started? Once you've got life, it's easy. You just go to some place where it's got water, because life on Earth occupies every conceivable area that has water, from the clouds through to the surface, down into the deep crust, because not all life needs sunlight. Primitive life can live off chemical energy in the deep crust from rocks. from hydrothermal vents, but it needs water. But in the early part, there's a different story. So currently, over the last few decades, actually, since the 1970s, people have thought of life originating in the deep oceans, at hydrothermal vents, where water of the ocean is circulated down into the crust through cracks, it's heated up by magma, and expelled back to the surface, in the process dissolving minerals and making these black smokers. So this is actually a source of future mineral wealth on Earth, but these black smokers are occupied by living communities just living off the chemical energy, often in water that's up to 4 kilometers deep. No sunlight whatsoever. They're chemical factories. And that model was based on this idea of making these sharp gradients, these sharp chemical gradients, and that creates some complexity that people thought were interesting for the origin of life. And that's true. You can do some mineral reactions in those environments. This model of primitive microbes living in deep sea vents was apparently supported by this diagram, one of the first iterations of the current tree of life, where we've got 3 main branches of life: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryotes. And the most primitive organism of all those different branches was found to really like hot water. They're called hyperthermophiles, and they can live at temperatures up to 120 degrees Celsius. So this seemed to fit that idea of life originating at deep, hot, black smokers. But science progresses, and this model has actually changed as they understand more and more about microbes. That tree of life, they found that the most heat-loving organisms in red are actually somewhere in the middle, and in fact, the most primitive organisms like just warm temperatures. So it started to question whether you could get life at these deep-sea hydrothermal vents if that's where life started. So the people who had proposed these deep-sea models changed their mind, and they thought, okay, instead of the really hot ones, we'll go to warm ones. And they changed the chemistry. They said you could still get water-rock interactions. The system changes a little bit, but instead of really hot ones, we now have, instead of 400 degrees, we've got 120 and lower. You make these little complexes, and off you go. So that's been the model for a long time, but unfortunately, it has a critical error. And that error actually comes in 2 flavors. One was pointed out in this paper in 2011, that all modern cells across the 3 branches of life have their internal cytoplasm that has a composition that's very different from seawater. So you'd think that if life got started in the oceans, it would use seawater and they'd be all happy. But in fact, the internal cytoplasm has a potassium to sodium ratio that's almost identical to fresh water, not seawater. The other big problem is that oceans are these enormous uniform reservoirs that are very dilute. So if you want to make life, think about in your kitchen. If you're making your favorite dish for dinner and you want to make it really flavorful, you have to boil off all the water, add your nice, yummy ingredients, and concentrate that. Well, if you add ingredients to the ocean, you never concentrate it and make it yummy. It's always salty. But in a small volume of water, that's when you can concentrate elements. And so fresh water becomes an interesting thought in that idea. The other aspect of that is that although hydrothermal systems can make water-rock interact and make some ions available, again, you can't concentrate them. And you only concentrate a certain few. It turns out there's a paper here by Steve Benner's group from Harvard that show that you need boron to help make these little organic molecules more complex. And boron you cannot get concentrations of in the deep ocean. So there's indications from the geochemistry that those deep sea vents don't work. But this is really the key here, is that all the reactions to make very simple molecules on your left more complex, and at the bottom you'll see we're getting towards nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. All of those reactions need you to kick out water. They're called condensation reactions, and it's the effect of drying that glues together the organic molecules into more complex forms to make the RNA and DNA that we use to exchange and replicate our cellular material. So the deep oceans are out. You've got to have dry conditions so you can lose water for the time before life. And this has actually been known since the time that we started to think about these deep sea vents. There's a couple of quotes here from 1982. The top one says that all the major biopolymers, that means complex organic molecules, are metastable in aqueous solution, meaning that they will break down underwater. You'll never get complex molecules building up to chains that can be used for life. And in the bottom quote, a colleague of mine, Dave Deemer, at University of California, Santa Cruz, says, you can heat a solution of those simple molecules in water forever, but you'll never make a complex molecule. And that's now been proven in the lab. But he says, on the other hand, making these complex molecules can occur if the amino acids are in a dry state. The source of the energy to bind them is that a water molecule is kicked out. So this water problem is becoming now really recognized across the community. Where can you get these reaction centers where you can have both water and drying conditions? Well, you can get it in hot springs on a land surface. So has anybody been to Iceland? Yeah, 1, 2. There are good hot, 3, 4, good. There's good hot springs there. This is Geysir, the type place where they first identified geysers, like Old Faithful. And they go off every hour or so, and the pool that they sit in rises and then drops. It wets and dries. And these sites are perfect reactors for making complex organic molecules. The other amazing thing about hot springs is they occur in fields that are chemically diverse and complex, all within a short distance. So I could have a pool at the back of the auditorium that's a pH of 2, and I could be at a neutral pH, just like we have here in Rotorua, and they mix and match ingredients. This one's sulfur-rich at the bottom. The top, the orange, is all living microbes inhabiting that nice warm water, and they become zones of very, very high complexity and free energy. So on the map on the right, all the dark spots are different hydrothermal fields around that area of New Zealand, and they exchange information by splashing, by subterranean networks, and by wind and water. So we get very excited about that because Carl Sagan said that life might need 1 trillion reactions to occur. And if you have a hot spring field of 100 different pools, all with different chemistry, geysers that erupt every hour, 24 hours a day, you can make 1 trillion reactions in 10 million years. So it's possible, and this is revolutionary thinking, that life may have got started on planets quickly, not over billions of years, but in orders of something like 10 million years. The other great thing about hot springs, and this is Dave Deemer again, down in the bottom left, he's pouring a simple organic solution into a pH 2 hot spring, an acidic hot spring, and he finds that they make these lipid vesicles that are the same size as our cells, as modern simple cells, and the areas where there's red concentrations are concentrations of organic molecules inside the cells. They are starting to physically, actively, really do experiments in real-world situations that are starting to make some of the components of life. And this is a diagram borrowed from biology where you get different pools and they mix and match information, and eventually they lead to a peak of innovation, higher complexity. And what I love in the idea of hot spring pools is that maybe you can make the membrane in one pool, a complex organic molecule in another pool, and have some elements that are constant, and you just mix and match the components. So instead of saying A to B to C to D, you do it by messy chemistry. You mix things together. And that's a brand new field, very exciting. So this idea of ours has led to a model that was published in Scientific American last year. It made the cover of Scientific American about an origin of life in hot springs. It's not a new idea. Charles Darwin thought of it 145 years ago, but we're just copying him. But in that model, shown in more detail here, there's a stepwise increment in complexity from the accumulation of organic molecules from outer space concentrating them in hot spring pools, step 3. And then in those pools that undergo wet drying cycles, you start to make these protocells that concentrate organics. And as they dry out, those cells open up. The organic molecules become more complex. And when you re-wet, they reform with more concentrated, complex organic material inside. And you do that thousands and thousands of times. Then it gets established, and finally it adapts to the oceans. So what about the record of life on Earth? I showed you this picture before. Is there any indication that ancient life has this contribution or lived in hot springs? Well, this is actually part of the reason how I got involved in early life. We've got an area that we've studied for many years, and we had recognized these life forms, and that was on a planet that was quite different 3.5 billion years ago. If I was able to sit on a pier looking out over the ocean with my favorite cooling summer drink, I would see that the oceans were green, not blue, because they're rich in dissolved iron. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere, but high in carbon dioxide, so the sky would have been orange. And then the land, without any living cover of plants or fungi, would have just been volcanic black. And so if we were in a satellite looking back at Earth 3.5 billion years ago, we would see a green planet with black continents and fluffy orange clouds. You can see I'm not a very accomplished artist, but this is what Earth would have looked like 3.5 billion years ago. The life that we studied was growing in a volcano, in an area covered, well, we thought always covered by water, where there's circulating fluid shown in blue, and the stromatolites were living in the surface. But what we found, in fact, it was a PhD student of mine, Tara Jokic, she found that there were periods when there was no water cover, when it was an exposed land surface. And in 2017, she published her first ever scientific paper. It got to Nature Communications because she made a discovery. And this is the business that we're all in. We're all in the business of making new discoveries, whether it's about ourselves, about the way we sleep, about consciousness, or about science. There's still vast fields waiting to be explored, new discoveries to be made, and Tara was able to do that. She found this little rock slice, which I've shown in a blown-up view, only 1 centimeter across, with these very irregular bumps and layers and patterns. And when you analyze the chemistry and look at those textures, the only place in the entire world that that particular rock forms is from a geyser. These are the deposits of splashing hot water 3.5 billion years ago. And I've shown a little blown up called Ancient. That's 3.5 billion-year-old geyserite from this blown up area in the square. And below is geyserite from New Zealand. That's 4 years old. They are absolutely one-to-one identical. And they're both rich in a mineral called titanium, and that does not form anywhere else but in geysers. So she was able to show that we had exposed land surface with hot springs, and moreover, when we looked in the browny areas between the geyserite, we found these round structures outlined by black. And they have a very peculiar feature that inside they show these crystals that are radiating inwards toward the center of those circular areas, hollow areas. And it turns out that these are bubbles filled later by minerals. And I have to ask you the question, even though you're not geologists, how do you get bubbles trapped in a rock? They're kind of incompatible. You've got a solid rock, but you have to have gas to make these bubbles. And the discovery that we had that these things were growing in hot springs, we actually found the answer by going to Rotorua. At the top is a hot spring just off the top of the surface, flowing down towards us with the bright white rocks. It's very hot there. And then where you get orange and brown, that's all microbial communities living in the warm water on the banks of this hot spring discharge. And when you look very carefully, you see these beautiful structures. These are all single-celled microbes, and they make a coating of polysaccharides, of sugar, and they're oxygen producers. And as they produce oxygen, they make bubbles. And that gets trapped in that sticky goo of the microbial community. There's another view down from above. Those are all bubbles. And this is actually the only way, once that microbial goo gets turned into rock, you preserve the bubbles. So, in fact, at 3.5 billion years ago, we've got evidence of life in hot springs. Some of the oldest life on the planet from hot springs. And furthermore, when we do some more detailed analyses, if we go in magnification from structures, this is not actually gold, it's pyrite, but as we look in more detail, we actually find fossilized cells preserved in these stromatolite structures from 3.5 billion years ago with organic matter preserved. This is also a brand new discovery. It's going to blow the field wide open. So we've actually been able to recreate an inhabited hot spring 3.5 billion years ago that has the right chemistry. It's got evidence of warm water, wet-dry cycles, and we think that maybe this is a really good setting to think about, could the origin of life have started there? And the key thing about hot springs in terms of looking elsewhere is that the silica that comes out preserves those traces of life. Hot springs are the Egyptian tombs of mummifying ancient life and preserving them through eons. So we think that this has extremely important astrobiological implications. There's a lot of interest now of going to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, which have these icy, watery surfaces. So you can see pictures there of these two moons, and there are jets of water vapor coming out from cracks in the ice. So people are very excited with that model of follow the water. But if you never had a rocky surface and hot springs, we would argue that life may never have had a chance to get started on these planets. And therefore, it would be a waste of time to spend a probe going there to search for life. We don't think there would be. Same probably for Titan. There's not enough water, even though there are organic molecules. This is a moon further out in the solar system. And we don't think that that also either had the probability for life. So let's get back to Mars. Well, it turns out it has the right ingredients to make hot springs. It's got volcanic heat, and it had water in the deep past. But where would you go? You've got a whole planet, you've got one shot, where would you go to search for a life on a planet? That's a big ask. And I'll tell you what NASA's going to do, or what they are doing. At the moment, the Curiosity rover, the Mars Science Laboratory, is in Gale Crater, which is about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years old. It's a big crater. You can see the landing site. It's already there. They launched a few years ago. They've been exploring for about the past 5-6 years or so. This is the rover that they put up. It's big. It's the size of an SUV. And it's got 7 scientific instruments on board that can tell us about habitability, about whether there's water there, and even if there are organic molecules. It does a lot. And it went through this fantastic process. Did anybody look at the landing? The 7 minutes of terror. Have you heard about that? So it's far enough away that there was no communication. As the rover was plummeting through the atmosphere, they were biting their fingernails until it landed on the surface and gave back the first picture. They had no idea if it succeeded or not. It's an unbelievable achievement just to get a rover on that big on the surface of Mars through the sky crane apparatus. They were investigating, again, a flowing river that came into a delta into the crater, looking for life, or at least signs of habitability in this ancient system. So these are all the scientific instruments on that rover, but the coolest of all was Chemcam, which is actually a laser beam situated in the head that shoots out at the rock surfaces, zaps it with high energy, makes a vapor spray, and then they have an analyzer on board that can tell what the chemistry and the composition of the rocks are. So they can see if they want to say, oh, is that rock interesting or is that one interesting? They can actually just go around zapping the rocks and figuring out if that's the right target or not. Totally cool. And this is a picture from MSL on the surface of Mars in those lake deposits. Can you see the fine layering? Those are put down by standing bodies of water looking towards Mount Sharp in the distance. And Curiosity used its drill to make these holes in the ground and sample the material that came out. They were looking for organic molecules, and they found some. Hooray! But they're not diagnostic of life. What they found are these simple pentagonal structures, very simple organic molecules that you can find anywhere in space. They could have come from life. Bigger molecules that have been broken down by high energy ultraviolet radiation. But it's not diagnostic of life and can form through abiologic processes. This is what they're really looking for, a molecule that's only made by life, something very complex like a cholesterol or a sterol. They haven't found those yet. There's a new rover being sent up in 2020 by NASA, and in fact by 5 different nations in 2020 are launching to Mars. The United Arab Emirates, China, India, Europe, and NASA. Mars is getting busy, and it's an exciting time to be involved. The plan with Mars 2020 is to go up with a new rover. It's also got lots of fancy scientific machines, but the plan here is to actually take samples and put them on the surface for a future mission to come and pick them up and return them to Earth. When that's going to be, nobody knows, because they haven't developed the technology to get samples back from Mars yet. So you can see here in the official advertising blurb, date unknown. So I'll probably be old and gray. Oh, hold on, I'm already old and gray. Maybe I'll be retired by the time those samples come back. But still, an exciting opportunity. It's going to be almost a duplicate of MSL. This is Mars 2020 with a different cache of machines, but actually the same exploration strategy. They're going to where there's a flowing river, coming into a crater and making this beautiful delta of sediments, and they hope that there's concentrated organics. So we actually have a different idea of where to go and search for life on Mars. And it's based on those previous discoveries I've mentioned about life originating in hot springs and hot springs preserving traces of life. So we know that Mars has the right ingredients. It's got giant volcanoes. That's actually the biggest volcano known in the universe. It's Olympus Mons. It's 25 kilometers high. Think about that for a sec. I understand they're trying to build the tallest tower in Jeddah, 1 kilometer high. So 25. Oh my God. It's huge. See the caldera at the top? That's where our ancient life at 3.5 billion years formed, in a structure just like that. It also has this evidence for widespread water, so those are the right ingredients for hot springs on land. So I suggest, and our group is really trying to push, that we search for hot springs on Mars. And in fact, it's known that there are hot springs on Mars. This is the little volcano Nili Patera, and those arrows pointing to those white splotches are the silica-rich deposits from hot springs. Absolutely. So there are hot springs on Mars. And in fact, NASA's already visited one. This is the track of the Spirit rover in red, and it ended up getting stuck in the sand at home plate. But on the way, it found these really beautiful structures that are nodular structures made of opaline silica from hot springs. There are known hot spring deposits on Mars that just get me so excited. And I'll show you why, because that's a picture from Mars. The geological hammer is not real, that's superimposed, but it gives you an idea of scale. And then here on the right, this is work by Steve Ruff. In the red are a close-up of those nodular structures. And can you see they have like the Maradona hand of God? They've got what we call digitate protrusions. They look like fingers sticking out of these nodules, shown in the close-up through here. And it's from that area to the right. These all have that kind of texture. And Steve went to a place in the most arid Mars-like conditions on Earth in the Atacama Desert, and he found hot springs that make identical structures. And those digitate structures on Earth are made by communities of microbes. So if we sort of put that package together, here's what those microbes look like. Those green strings in the bottom image are from one of those broken off digitate structures on Earth. We haven't had the technology yet to do that on Mars. And I would love to get one of those little samples back here and have a look with my microscope. So we're pretty excited about hot springs. We think they're the way to go to search for evidence of ancient life, both on Earth and on Mars, for all of the reasons that I've gone through and cited here. And I want to thank you very much for coming out and listening to my story, to our story, because the origin of life is where we all come from. And if you're interested to see a little bit more, I'm going to put up a little trailer for a movie, an IMAX film that we're showing tonight at 7:30 that I was very fortunate to be part of the making the last couple of years. So let's see if this works.
Just how was our small planet born? Through what dramatic chain of events did our Earth transform and nurture life? Earth's remarkable story comes alive through breathtaking visualizations based on the latest science. Come with us on an odyssey of discovery, on a quest to uncover the origins of our planet. Join our geologists as they trace back billions of years and witness their discoveries that change our understanding of how life first formed. This is our planet. And this is its incredible story. The story of Earth. Now playing in IMAX and giant screen theaters.
Thank you very much.
All right. Martin, thank you very much for an absolutely fantastic and fascinating story. Now remember, he's the director of the Big Question Institute. So the floor is open for big questions and small questions. Please go ahead. We have in the back there.
That's a dangerous thing.
Hello. Okay.
Hello.
One of the questions I have for you is when you talked about the different nations that are trying to go to 2020 on Mars.
Yeah.
Would you say it's going to be a race for the nations? And I don't know, to get a certain thing or a certain accomplishment for their nation?
So all of the different missions have different reasons for going. And so I don't think there's competition so much as a rising interest in Mars. If you think about a whole planet and drop down a little probe, it's really just a pinprick. So even if two rovers landed in the same place, you would uncover news stories, interesting information. So I don't see it as a competition. I see it as a collaboration across humanity. And I think there's great possibilities for future exploration of Mars as we get to know more about the planet, refine where we go, and refine our understanding of how we arose as a species on Earth.
There's a question up here.
Thanks. Great talk, thanks. I have two questions that are a little bit connected though. So you mentioned that the earliest life goes back to 3.5, 3.7 billion years.
Yeah.
But I remember reading headlines and that claimed that they had found indications that were even 4.1 billion years old. So I would like you to comment on that. What is kind of, whether that's consensus, controversy, or whatever. What is, the earliest science that we really have? Because that would really shrink the window to extremely small, the window between cooling down and actually having already the first signs.
Yep.
And for me as a biochemist, that's very interesting, because it is a very complex machine that we are looking at.
Yeah.
How it can develop in this short time. And the other question was, it's a bit of a strange coincidence, the way you describe it, that you propose the hot spring as the origin of life kind of location, and magically at the same time it's also preserving those origins.
Yeah.
Could it not be like that you're having a bias there because this is what you can observe, happens to be the earliest one, but that doesn't mean that it's really developing right there?
No.
That it's just a location that is preserving those early conditions very well.
Yeah, both really great questions. If you're not a geologist, I applaud you for a quite deep understanding of the challenges that we face. So let me begin by saying that almost every aspect of the studies of ancient life are controversial, because we are really pushing the forefront of our knowledge. And if you think about it, life is a chemical system. And being able to define the difference between chemistry and life is actually a huge and complex problem. And this is reflected a little bit in the fact that there is no accepted definition of life itself, because it's such a complicated spread to very simple organisms that don't self-replicate, like viruses, for example. Are they alive? So that's still a bit of a problem. In terms of the 4.1 publication, I reviewed that paper for Nature. I wasn't very impressed. There was nothing there that was a smoking gun or a diagnostic proof for life, and most of the community does not regard that as evidence for life. Furthermore, the age dating is also highly controversial, and I think has now been proven to be about 3.8. It's not 4.1. So I'd say no. The stuff that I showed you is community-wide the most broadly accepted evidence for life at 3.5. At 3.7, I was involved in the discovery of stromatolites from Greenland, but it didn't have the convergent lines of evidence to support the morphology. Nevertheless, you're very right that if we think about that big meteorite impacting history up till about 3.8, and then either 3.5 or 3.7, that window for the start of life and making complex life gets quite narrow. So I'll leave it there, and if you want to talk further, we can get into the nuts and bolts about it. There's a question in the side wing there. Oh, we've got one here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. The main takeaway for me today from this lecture was the involvement of hot springs and how they could explain the origin
life on land. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a relatively new discovery though, and so we haven't heard any of the say drawbacks or points that could challenge this discovery or theory. So could you please comment on that?
Absolutely. So we are in early days, and I'll be absolutely frank about that. But the deep sea vent group, and it's many groups around the world, they've been doing experiments in the lab to recreate these deep sea environments and try to grow polymers for 20 years, and they haven't been able to grow polymers. And we're going, surprise, surprise, right? I mean, that's well known in theory. So I think what's happening is that there's an increased recognition of the problem with deep sea vents. And hot springs are exciting because they have many of the same aspects as deep sea vents. They've got hot water, minerals, fluid, rock interaction, etc., but they've got more in terms of complexity. What we don't know is how much you can actually do in hot springs. And so this is just very early days. But in terms of my knowledge and background as a geologist, working in systems from volcanoes to magmas to life to sediments, that is the best environment for making complex systems. And really, that's where we're starting now. So obviously, there are things to test. The other good thing, which I didn't mention about hot springs, is that you have areas where you've got hot to warm water, but you also have vapors. So you get high surface area droplets, and you get areas below surface where you get recharge boiling. So there are all kinds of different environments. And there's more. I didn't get into it, but it turns out actually to make some polymers, you need UV light. And so, again, on the surface, not in the oceans. So it's a paradigm shift that we're in the middle of. And my student who found that guy's right, she went to the Origin of Life conference, the Gordon conference, at the beginning of 2017, and everybody was talking about life on land. Nobody really about the deep sea. So we're trying obviously to test our model and build it, and that's how science works. So you're hearing early stuff here. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. The age of Mars and the age of Earth is almost similar.
Yep.
Which factor do you think that prevented Mars to create the similar life that we have here?
So very, very deep question. Some have suggested that the activity of plate tectonics on Earth is actually a prerequisite for life. And the reason that's important is for two. One, you need a global ocean to make plate tectonics. And it's actually very simple because rocks are hard. But when you add water, they become soft and slippery. And so that allows for recycling. Planets that don't have water, the Moon, Venus, Mars, not oceans of it, they don't have plate tectonics. Every planetary body loses heat to space, right? It's just conduction driven by convection. And on Earth, because there's water and it makes the crust soft, we get plate tectonics. And plate tectonics is important because that process of recycling crustal material in the presence of water starts to change the chemistry in big volumes, right? Continental crust is very different compositionally from bulk Earth because of plate tectonics. On Mars, it's mostly magmas that derive straight from the mantle, and you don't get that extra differentiation because it never had plate tectonics. And that may be one limiting factor to getting life on Mars. It maybe didn't have enough plate tectonic-driven chemistry to get the elements we needed in a significant volume to make life. But we're still on early stages of that.
So one last question over here. So you mentioned that it takes maybe 1 trillion reactions to create life, perhaps. But these reactions are occurring maybe in many different locations at the same time, so perhaps it's after every geyser event, they're happening in parallel. Could this have, my first question is, could this have accelerated perhaps the formation of life? And secondly, are there locations on Earth today where life could be generated fresh, like separate from the initial origin that we just need to find and separate from that which already exists?
Right, so also two great questions. In terms of the first one, yeah, so there's a really pretty new developing field which is facilely called messy chemistry, but it's basically nonlinear dynamics. And certainly my generation and back, maybe not now so much for the youngest generation, but we were taught in what was essentially a very Linnaean method. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to E. But actually this idea of messy chemistry is exactly how you pointed it out. Maybe you do one here, one there, and then you have these different reactions going on and they accelerate each other, that sort of peak of innovation. Yeah, so that's very exciting. I think that's really a neat way to think about it. And then, sorry, just tell me the second part.
The second is, could life be originating today?
Right. So yeah, we've been asked this a lot, and people have thought about this. So can you make de novo life? Is it forming now? Well, the answer is that at the moment, life is everywhere on Earth. And if there's an organic compound that comes out that wants to get more complex, life grabs it first. So once life's established, microbial life, diverse microbial life, that game is over. But the challenge and the quest is to see if there is a second genesis on Mars where life started on its own there. So, yeah. Okay?
Please join me. So, Martin, we have a little gift, and I'm calling Mary Laura after her as well to hand it over to you, because she went through all kinds of trouble to make the movie happen and to get you here, and so it's a great achievement. So please, yeah.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you so much. A really great opportunity. And thank you all. I've had a wonderful visit to KAUST and really enjoyed